Roundtable's bringing together some of the contributors from a forthcoming anthology out in spring 2023 with Intellect Books called Fashion Education, The Systemic Revolution. Today, we're going to talk about some experiences of navigating, resisting, working to transform white supremacy culture in fashion education, and with a deep recognition of how these forces are interconnected with ableism, fat phobia, heteronormativity, and the gender binary. I'm so excited that we have some of our contributors today for this conversation. My name is Ben Berry. I use he, him pronouns. I'm Dean of Fashion at Parsons School of Design. I am a cisgender male with short brown hair, a brown beard, and I'm wearing gold glasses today. So to begin, and by way of introduction, I want to ask our panelists if they could locate themselves and briefly share their journey into and within fashion education. And perhaps they could also start by offering a visual description of themselves. So Tanveer, why don't we begin with you?
Hi there, thanks for the introduction, Ben. My name's Tanveer Ahmed, and to visually describe myself, I have dark brown skin, dark brown, very black hair that's quite long and very thick, dark eyebrows. And I'm a cisgender female, and I use the pronouns her and she. To locate myself is, so I think, such a good way to start this conversation. I am currently working in London, capital city, a fashion metropole in the global north. But this is kind of contrast with my upbringing, which is, although it is London, I teach in a college that's round the corner from where I grew up, in King's Cross. My upbringing is as a South Asian of Indian ethnicity. My parents were born in colonial era India, so that's really informed who I am. They're quite old, my parents. My dad remembers where he was when Gandhi was assassinated. He's in his 90s. So they're very clear about what colonialism did to them, and I was brought up with a strong sense of what colonial history has done and how it continues to be reproduced. And so surrounded by objects in London museums, my upbringing was going to those museums but seeing an alternative understanding of those objects. I was taught from a very young age that these objects, to really question the labelling on museum pieces, and that they weren't necessarily just acquired or donated, that to question where they came from. And that was from a super young age, from 4 or 5. So yeah, that's where I've come from, and that's where I'm situated now.
Thank you very much, Tanveer. Riley, can I pass it over to you?
Sure. Ani Bojo, everyone. My name is Riley Kucheran, but I'm from the Desmoulin family of Beek-Dagong Nishnawbeg, or Pick River First Nation, one of the Indigenous or Aboriginal or First Peoples of Canada. I'm a very new professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, which was formerly named Ryerson University. It was a very important colonial figure. And I want to locate myself first in my traditional territory, because I'm actually not in Toronto. I'm in Beek-Dagong, which is about 11-hour drive from downtown Toronto, and we're right in the bush, as you might say, so in the thick boreal forest of northern Canada. And it's beautiful. I try to spend as much time up here as possible, mainly because I didn't get this experience of being on my own land or living in my own culture as a child, because of colonial circumstances. You might have heard of the residential school project or system. And so starting with my grandmother, who was not allowed to speak her language or live her culture, that was kind of disrupted in my family. And so I didn't get a lot of that growing up. But it was through my education and starting in my master's where I started visiting with Indigenous scholars all over Canada and learning about that history that I didn't have access to growing up. And through those experiences of education, Ironically, not in fashion education, just in interdisciplinary education. I kind of got grounded in decolonizing theories and resurgent theories. So this idea of returning to ourselves or rebuilding indigenous worlds, indigenous fashion systems. And that's kind of the perspective that I've been bringing to the School of Fashion at Toronto Metropolitan.
Thanks so much, Riley. Grace, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grace John. If you could kind of bear with me, I have like a mocha sweatshirt, colored sweatshirt, curly hair, long and black, and also very thick eyeliner. But it may look like I'm tired, but I'm not. I'm extremely excited. And currently, I'm located in Seoul, Korea at the moment. And speaking of, I think, a little bit of our lineage, colonialism, and heritage, I'm a Korean American immigrant citizen. My parents immigrated to the States in the 80s. And so I'm actually here for family business and to kind of really get to know, I think, different ways of where my parents were raised and how that's impacted a lot of my education and my journey through, of course, fashion and as well as design. I'm currently assistant professor at University of Georgia. Previously, I was at Parsons School of Design. And I guess my realm or journey into fashion education was quite an accidental journey. It didn't come into as I guess, a traditional type of way for me. I learned from a lot of the seamstresses in the garment district in New York. And that was my first experience of really understanding how to construct clothing. I thought it was like origami for the body, and I got really fascinated. And so that's led me to doing some of the work that I'm doing today.
Thank you so much, Grace. Kelly, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, everyone. I am Kelly Reddy Best, and I have white skin, and I have short brown curly hair, and I'm wearing black mascara on my eyelashes, and I have a pink fuzzy sweater on today. And I have like round, large cheeks when I smile. And I am currently located in Ames, Iowa, in the United States, which is in the middle of the country. And I teach at what's called a predominantly white institution. And these institutions in the United States are a result of the Morrill Act, which was in the 19th century, where the federal government took land from indigenous populations and gave money to the states to then provide education. And so the town that I'm in is surrounded by farmland, and there are mostly white people in the university and in the surrounding town. And it's a fairly, it's a largely conservative leaning state that I live in. But I came to this, I studied at different universities in the United States, and I now teach in a fashion department.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And Sang, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Ben. My name is Sang Tai. I'm, I guess, East Asian person with no hair. I'm bald, so I'm wearing thin metal glasses with a black headset, and I'm currently wearing a black t-shirt, and my pronouns are he and him. I'm a lecturer and creative practice researcher at RMIT University, located in Australia, on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, on the Aboriginal lands of the Indigenous First Nations people of Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge their ancestors and elders past, present, and also emerging. I'm a lecturer at RMIT University School of Fashion and Textiles, and I teach into the Bachelor of Fashion Design degree program. In terms of my journey into fashion, I actually completed an undergraduate architecture degree and somehow convinced my parents that I wanted to study fashion design, despite being a first-generation refugee with Chinese Cambodian and therefore destined to otherwise be doctors or lawyers. But here I am, a fashion designer by trade. I went on to complete a fashion design degree at RMIT University and worked as a menswear designer in the Australian industry via a couple of internships in New York. I was the head designer in a streetwear company before joining the university as an industry fellow. And currently, I'm a little over midway through a creative practice-based PhD titled All Tea No Shade, which explores, I guess, intersectional methods for producing fashion that embody the identity and experiences of the queer Asian diasporas through the t-shirt. And the project that I wrote about in the book really, I think, informed what I'm doing in terms of research now.
Thank you so much. It's so nice that we can gather together across lands over this world in many time zones right now. Riley, I know you the best, and obviously for a while, but everyone else, this is one of the first times, some of you I've met before, but the first times I actually get to meet you, and I'm really glad that we get to connect in conversation versus email. This is really a special moment, so I'm excited for our conversation today. The next question I'd love to discuss is if you could share the course or teaching intervention that you wrote about in your chapter. And I know some of you wrote about several interventions you made, and so perhaps you could move us through one of these interventions, explaining a little bit about how you developed it and what the learning was like for your students. And maybe if we begin with you, Grace, to start.
Sure, thank you, Ben. I guess for one of the courses that I focused on for the chapter was really from my experience jumping into fashion. I didn't mention this before, but I had majored in graphic design, and then I worked in the IT industry prior coming into fashion. Why those two are important is because user experience design and also integrating technology, I thought would be best explored when it's inclusive of people with disabilities. So the chapter that I wrote was how do you create a curriculum that helps that kind of intersectionality, but as well as understanding that there's a strong co-design process that we're missing if we're teaching about how to make fashion accessible to people. And where technology comes in is there are so many different types of material sciences, I guess electronics, wearable tech that is kind of coinciding with fashion studies. And so there are also rehabilitation methods and other types of solutions that I've seen that are really beneficial to pretty much work together. And so I talk about how interdisciplinary design and how that influences fashion curriculum could really be a good start. And one project in particular I talk about is Open Style Lab, which is a nonprofit that I'm currently a part of as their CEO and one of their board members. It's a nonprofit organization that started at MIT and it's dedicated to making style accessible to people with disabilities. And we do that by bringing in people who have engineering backgrounds to occupational therapists with fashion designers to co-create with a disabled person. And of course, we find out quickly, what are some of those challenges for students as well as working professionals and how to actually start that dialogue. Do you say, am I a person with a disability? Am I a disabled person? Am I a person living with a disability? Like, how do you want to be identified? So the whole idea of body identification and exploring that through clothes is the program that I had helped to really foster and develop, and then replicated that at Parsons School of Design, where I taught for about 5 years. Currently at the University of Georgia, which is in Atlanta. It's a whole different ballpark from New York City. So I haven't started on that yet, but that was part of the chapter that I contributed with Ben and Deborah. So I'll pass them along since we're also short in time.
Thanks so much, Grace. Riley, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks. I also realized I forgot to give a visual description after hearing all of your lovely visual descriptions. I am looking kind of morbid today. I'm wearing a black blouse that looks like I'm attending a funeral, but I am happy to be here. And with a long, slicked back ponytail, I do identify as non-binary and use they, them pronouns. I am one of those people who wrote about many interventions for my chapter. I wrote about all of my interventions that I did in my first year of teaching. So it was very much like an experimental, jumped into the deep end and kind of reflected on that and the weird intersections and challenges I faced. And so I tried to indigenize, if we can use that word, or bring indigenous perspectives, decolonize perspectives to all my courses. So in an introduction to entrepreneurship, I just foregrounded BIPOC entrepreneurs, right? Used the case studies from BIPOC entrepreneurs to see how they interact with the fashion system. I worked with Angela de Montigny, a Cree Métis designer who really uses her spirit to inform her designs, and she creates these retail environments that are about relationships and getting to know people rather than making a sale, which is incredible. I took a course on design history, which was very Eurocentric, very arts-based, very canonical, kind of like the icons of design, and you would see the usual names in that course, but I turned it upside down, I thought, and rearranged it to be thematic. And so, can we look at the design of colonialism across time? Can we look at how racism is designed, how it seeps into our urban planning design, for example? Into graphic design, we looked at like the chop suey font, which is this like very racist font you see in Asian restaurants, and kind of unpacked that. So I think just giving a different perspective, they still kind of got the canon of design, I'd say, but from a very critical perspective. But I think the course I'm most excited about and proud of is a course on leather and fur. And it was our intention to do hide tanning. So the indigenous practice of sustainable, respectful, an animal hunt, and then you skin it and you tan it and you create this really supple leather. And it's such a beautiful process. It's a lot of hard work. It takes a lot to tan a hide, and it gives you a lot of appreciation for leather and suede and fur. But the pandemic hit and we couldn't do it in person. So instead we did fish skin tanning. So turning fish skins into leather, which has all of the same beautiful properties of indigenous fashion. It's sustainable, it's really interconnected, it like honors the land. But it was something that we could all do in our kitchens on Zoom. And I think the most beautiful part of that course was that fish skin tanning is an indigenous practice found globally, in North America, in European countries, Asian countries. And so I think students could kind of see how, quote, traditional practices turn up in all of our cultures. I'm not here to teach students how to be indigenous designers. I'm teaching them how to appreciate indigenous values and perspectives, and to then become introspective and look at their own cultures and see the beauty of that, and to not feel like they have to shed their individuality or their culture to kind of make it in fashion, which I think is so often the narrative. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Riley. Sang, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure, thanks, Ben. I actually ran a studio project for Year 3 fashion design students, where students designed and constructed outfits for some drag performers for the Broken Hill Festival in 2018 and subsequently again in 2019, just before the pandemic, so when we could actually do things. The Broken Hill Festival is an annual festival that takes place in outback or the desert central Australia in the town of Broken Hill. And the festival name is actually a pun on the town name, where it's a broken heel as in the shoe heel versus the hill as in the hill itself, as in the mountain hill. It's basically a drag festival that celebrates the iconic Australian movie, The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which was filmed in part in Broken Hill. And I don't know how familiar people are with this outside of Australia, but maybe in the queer community more so. So the project basically came out of, I guess, RMIT University's Indigenous reconciliation work. We work with 6 drag queens, including Fulma Box, who's one of the festival directors, Karen from Finance, Art Simone, I don't know if they're familiar to some people, from the RuPaul's Drag Race Down Under franchise. And we also worked with Indigenous drag queens Felicia Fox and Jojo Zaho. So the project basically involved a range of activities that I guess engaged in different ways with the various themes that we were looking at. Things like there was a cultural appropriation workshop which focused on, I guess, Black Indigenous communities in Australia. We looked at working with methods for exaggerated gender performance, including padding and creating extreme proportions. And we also really try to engage with, I guess, this dialogue about Australiana and Australia identity as a kind of broader theme. So the students basically worked in groups to design a range of outfits with a show reveal moment that was performed on the main stage of the festival. And the students were really encouraged to, I guess, engage with the personas of the drag queens. We were really lucky to have funding that allowed the students to actually attend the event. So it was a bit of a long drive. It was a 9-hour ride on a coach to see their work on stage. And overall, I guess, in terms of thinking about the student learning, I think it was quite multifaceted. I mean, we're still really grappling in Australia with the truths of the past through colonisation and the marginalisation of our Indigenous peoples. And it was really a great opportunity to open this dialogue and also consider how we might engage respectfully with Indigenous knowledges. I mean, for me, this was really just the beginning of my learning as much as it was for the students in this actual space. The action costumes for the show were just the first part of the studio project we ran, and then we started to, I guess, unpack the implications of drag in terms of understanding gender, performativity, and all those, hegemonic expression of these things as well. And so I guess thinking about performance and play and drag is a really interesting space because there's also space to consider, I guess, it through a bit of a racial lens in the case of, I guess, our Black Indigenous communities and introduce them to the ideas of intersectionality as well. And for me, I think I learned a lot through this process about my own identity. I identify as a gay man, and it really led me to reflect on my own experience in the fashion industry and how my own experiences were often not represented through the work I actually did and the things that I designed. I mean, a lot of the things that I really discovered through writing this particular chapter, it's really informed the research that I'm looking at now in terms of drawing through my own lived experience and finding ways to, I guess, for that to inform fashion. I think the other thing for me to really think about is that it's quite, I guess, easier to draw through your own lived experience to think about your own marginalisation, but it's much harder to then extrapolate that and consider the marginalisation of others as well. And so this is a space that I'm really interested in terms of my teaching as well, thinking about design practices of allyship.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kelly, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, so in the contribution that I made, it was co-written with a student whose name is Brandon Spencer, and we co-developed a course called Black Lives Matter, Fashion Liberation and the Fight for Freedom. And the importance of the course is that, so Brandon is one of the very few Black males who were in our program. He recently graduated and is back in Chicago. And like many of the students of color, experienced like various microaggressions and overt discrimination on the campus, living in a predominantly and navigating a predominantly white space. And in the course, and specifically like before we partnered, he wanted to write a story for the school newspaper about Black identity and Black Lives Matter with the intersections of fashion, and the editors had denied him. They like weren't interested, and so he had like this like series of experiences, and then he took my class, and it's a huge 300-person course, and he sat in the front row, and we became, even in that big class, he was like super interested and awesome, and was interested in seeing himself represented. And so we began a relationship, and he would come to my office hours, and then I was like, let's do this, like, let's just pitch a course. And so I worked with him, and my department chair was really supportive. And in the course, we really look at like Black identity and fashion. We look at like the intersections of like resistance movements and politics, and then also like how those intersect with the fashion industry. And I think that one of the coolest parts was that Brandon like helped choose the readings, right? He named the course, and he did it through this. He applied to this like we have this like so-called prestigious like internship in our college, and so he applied through that, and like he was paid like to do this work, right? So that way it wasn't just him like doing this additional labor, and so yeah, it was really amazing in the sense that he like could vision this course, and then it came into fruition and we taught it, and now and it's still running. So I think yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kelly. Tanveer, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, thank you. It's great to hear everybody's contributions. My one was, in some ways sounds really simple. It's called Decolonizing the Mannequin. And it was just the very simple observation that when we're teaching fashion design, the mannequin that we use in the classroom is embedded with all these norms, gender binary norms, body shape norms. So as a result of students using that resource, they're excluding different types of bodies, and they reproduce the standardized body in the classroom. And it, you know, in many ways, it seems so simple, and that, you know, I look around and I've taught in lots of different, I'm sure similar to all of you, many different fashion colleges. And the first thing that you see when you walk into the classroom are these mannequins that students work on. And everybody treats them as if they're invisible. They don't really notice them. And yet, how are you expected to work beyond the heteronormative body classification systems if you keep working on that resource? It was a really important intervention for me because it helped open up so many other ways that we classify bodies in the fashion design process, and we then reproduce those body norms in the designs that students do. So the intervention that I did, and I've done it in a few different colleges, and the college that I wrote about weren't actually that happy with the project that I ran, but I just got students to really just expose how they're working, and to really kind of visibilize this ubiquitous resource that's used all the time. So I asked students, who are they designing for when they begin to design, and I started to share with them people who were important to me in my life. So I took a very deliberative, kind of situated and relational approach to designing. So I shared with them people who were important to me, my grandparents, my parents. I shared pictures of myself as well, and realised that I don't usually share all the parts of me. So I'm brought up as a Muslim, and sometimes I cover my hair. And I realised that I never kind of share that with students. So by showing these different types of bodies, I then started to say to students, well, who's important to you in your life? You know, make a list of a few people that are important to you. And so they're kind of doing this, thinking, where's this all going? Then I started to ask them, well, have you ever designed for them? You know, and it then dawns on students that no, they don't. Like, some might say, oh, I've designed for, you know, the sister or something for a party, but then they slowly realize, no, we're never designing for, you know, bodies, a diverse range of bodies. And subsequently then I start to say, so who are you designing for? What bodies are you designing on? And then the kind of penny drops that, yeah, we're designing for this hard gender normed body in the classroom. And so then I got students to then begin to design for people that they know, people that they have a relationship with, essentially diverse sets of bodies. And students start to use wadding to change the shape of the mannequins, to start to really recognize that the mannequin is this disembodied body. It has no head. And I used feminist Marxist theory, which kind of sounds all really heavy, but essentially became like my best friend because in my research, because it really exposes the material conditions of bodies for me, you know, of our conditions that we live with. I'm sorry. of bodies that we, or of the material conditions that surround us and how they are invisibilized and abstracted. And so by kind of translating that theory into a practical, very quite simple, really, exercise in the classroom, students started to kind of create different types of bodies and rethink the centrality of what it is they're doing. So a bit like, Grace, what you were saying about the user centeredness of other design disciplines, where the user is centered. In fashion, we have this abstracted body that's always this, you know, gender norm. It's skinny, it's thin, all those sorts of things. So yeah, but I mean, interestingly, the college that I did it in, they couldn't really see the purpose of it, and they thought the outcomes didn't look very nice, all this sort of thing. So you know, it shows the challenges, I think, of the aesthetics in the design process and how that's elevated above all other criteria.
Thank you. I think you've all done such a beautiful job of summarizing just a little bit of what you've written about. The contributions are so generous. They're written with so much care and really radical honesty. And I think provide much hope in terms of how change can begin by these small scale interventions in the classroom that really then can start to cycle up, cycle across, move in all kinds of ways. But the classroom is really a place where this change can begin. Tanveer, I want to pick up on sort of the last part of what you were talking about around resistance. Often this work to advance social justice in fashion education isn't utopian, but it's messy and it's contradictory. We often face resistance either from colleagues, and we also work within colonial institutions that haven't often been designed to support the very work we're doing. I'm wondering if you can share one place where you've experienced resistance and discuss a little bit about how you've navigated it. And saying, maybe we can begin this with you.
Sure. I think this one is really hard for me. I don't know if it's a cultural thing or the experience of being a refugee, but I've always been taught not to rock the boat, not to just go with what's going on. My place in this country is all so conditional on me fitting in. So I guess my approach to this maybe is slightly different, maybe a little less head on. I think I'm also really lucky that I work in an institution that has a real, I guess, commitment to social justice and in a place in the world that is actually quite progressive in relation to a lot of other places. I guess I think this work is really hard. I think this work requires a lot of support from leadership. I think it's about, you know, we're constantly asking people with the least privilege to stand up, challenge stigma. And I think, you know, for me, it's definitely going to the top and having those discussions. The other thing for me also, I think, which works in terms of the way that I work is because I'm a course coordinator and I run courses such as fashion design diversity, I can also invite other people in and start to ask them to think about their methods of doing research or producing or being creative and how they might see that through the diversity lens, how much we reframe that to include more people and encourage them to therefore bring in their skills and still value the skills that they have, but then use it in a way that is about, you know, that is progressing some kind of social justice. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, Ben.
Yeah, I think so much of our ability to advance change often is also tied to our own positionality and how we're located within the institutions that we're working within. Kelly, may I pass it over to you to answer this question?
Yeah, sure. I think that it was a very, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but in our experience, but so, you know, of course, I am a white person. And so I probably a significant amount of privilege. And most of my colleagues in my department are white. And so in our curriculum, we have to propose a new course. There's a process, you know, and for us, you propose it, there's a first reading, you know, there's a second reading, and then it goes up for a vote. And so I want to just preface this too with like Brandon wrote, and it was like in the chapter he wrote that this experience was like life changing for him, you know, and he had never like said that to me before. Like I knew he mentioned that it was, you know, I could tell it was like meaningful to him, and it was like more meaningful to both of us. But you know, and like reading that and then thinking about like how it went through the process. So Brandon wasn't there. And I should also say too, Brandon's an undergraduate student. You know, he's like not a graduate student. Like he was like a second, I believe like a second year undergraduate student. And had also experienced like some really horrific things from some of the faculty in my department, like horrifyingly horrible things. So as we're going through the curriculum process, there's always, you know, you have to make a motion. It's, you know, it's very formal. And then there's always this time for discussion. And during those times, you know, I'd present it and no one said anything. There was no like, and this isn't like that uncommon. I mean, there might be some times where there are, you know, a lot of discussion because it might impact course enrollment. You know, there's all many factors, right, that come into like proposing a new course into the curriculum. It's like, who's going to teach it? How's it going to impact student load? How's it going to impact, you know, the program? You know, there's so many, it's a huge puzzle, right, with so many moving parts, so many different things. But the thing that I was, and I'm not shocked, I guess, because I guess the institution in which I'm situated, but no one said a word. No one wrote to me any concerns or any questions. And at the same time that this course was going through the curriculum to get voted on, there was another course that was like marketing something, right? It was like just, you know, marketing something like not justice oriented, you know, is not centering. It's just probably like marketing for heteronormative like perspectives, I suppose. And then when we get the vote back, marketing unanimous, because we get the full, it's transparency. You get to see the full vote, and full vote. 3 people voted no on the course, and there was no. I mean, it still passed, right? So it's in our department, it's majority vote, and you know, whatever that percentage was. But and I was thinking to myself, nobody said a word. So in some ways, you know, of course, I view it as I was like, Brandon, and I told Brandon this. I was like, we still won, but you know, but like it's still like there were obviously people who didn't want that course, but they wanted this like marketing course that like I'm like, what new is this contributing to our department? You know, like, is this innovative? And so that's just one example. And then I do want to just share one other quick example that we experienced, because we went into, the students do a project where the purpose is to go out into the community and share the process and the end result with the community. And we had gone to a local coffee shop that was just recently built and started. It was kind of like, you know, very modern, kind of like cool coffee shop. And they like hang art on the wall. And I was like, oh, this would be a perfect spot. We'll do the project here. You know, we'll have the students do their final presentation here. We'll invite community members. And the coffee shop took like 3 weeks to get, they emailed me back and said, hi, thanks. And then they took 3 weeks to get back to us. And then they said, well, we don't want to ruffle, something along the lines of, we don't want to ruffle any feathers, and you might consider presenting this at the Black church. I was like, no. So then we ended up going to the public library downtown, and it was amazing and it was awesome. But you know, those were just 2 examples of resistance that we experienced in the process.
Wow, thank you, Kelly, very much for sharing that. Riley, I'll pass it over to you.
These are all awful experiences, but I was also looking forward to this part of the panel because it's the part where we get to spill the tea, to use Sang's earlier expression. And I like doing that. I like being the resistance. I think there's this overriding context in my chapter of burnout, experience, severe burnout after that first year teaching. And I think burnout is quite political. We do need to be paying more attention to burnout. I think avoiding burnout is wrapped up in a lot of privilege, and I think I'm still healing from that burnout, which is now like 2 years ago. I lasted 5 weeks in the city, and then I had to hightail it back to my territory and return to the land and kind of de-stress after spending so much time in downtown Toronto. I think part of that burnout came from being the only Indigenous person in my department, and being one of few Indigenous faculty or graduate students at my institution as a whole. I was called upon a lot for service work, we call it here, so being on committees, review panels, all of that. And I think I naively said yes to a lot of that because I never received those kinds of opportunities. And I think, I learned a lot, but it has its toll, and experienced like so many microaggressions that, it might just be a flippant comment or something like that, but it triggers so much. Like, I'm living with intergenerational traumas. Like, when we talk about residential school systems, or Reconciliation Day was this past Friday here in Canada, it's a deeply triggering thing because it affects my family. My entire family attended residential school, so deeply kind of traumatic to get those little aggressions. But the one resistance I was thinking about does relate to funding and money. We're not a very wealthy institution. It's a public institution here in Canada, so we don't have bankrolls of donors and an endowment fund. And so Sang mentioned, this act of inviting people in, and kind of like sharing the stage, passing over the mic. And I would love to do that, but there aren't resources to adequately compensate those guests. And it's particularly problematic when you think about Indigenous ontologies where elders or knowledge keepers are hunters or people in community. They don't have degrees, they aren't academics. And so you have to invite people in, but you don't have the money to do so. And also, like, I don't have this infinite wisdom. Like, I am Indigenous, but I don't know traditional knowledges. I don't know all the stories or the culture. And so when you're expected to know that and unable to then provide that, it's a difficult place to be in, I think. So related to that, I think the second kind of piece of this is also, I guess, just like flexibility. There isn't flexibility in what you can, offer in certain respects because of funding, but also flexibility of location. I would love to be on my land permanently, but it's kind of just the state right now where you have to often go to an urban center to be successful in fashion. It's often said, you have to hit up a major city, but this idea that Indigenous academics need to be working in institutions physically, I think we need to challenge. And so many of us Indigenous academics went home during the pandemic and taught on Zoom, and I like fell in love with this territory that I hadn't had an opportunity to spend a lot of time in. So I'd love to stay here and continue to work on the land, but there's challenges faced with that, and the university, I think, is resistant to letting people stay and teach virtually. But it's something that's so important for Indigenous methodologies and research and pedagogy. I think you learn so much on the land, and I'd love to bring students and introduce them to my territory and the stories that you get from working and creating on the land, but it's not feasible at the moment.
Thank you, Riley. Tanveer, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. I think this is a really, such an important question about resistance, and I think for all of us, I suppose maybe treading carefully about resistance, because it happens, I think, from both educators and students, and it's a really complex area. But what I suppose when I think about things much more systemically and think about things overall. So I think for me, thinking about resistance and my own research is about anti-racism would be maybe about the kind of dominant paradigm of liberal values and how that works against this kind of work, I think, because the dominant idea is that, I'm against racism, I'm a non-racist, and that's not what the project of anti-racism is. As we know, it's about foregrounding anti-racism, starting off every conversation with what racism does. And so being confronted with non-racism and a culture that is, particularly in fashion, I think, where colleagues would be horrified to be to be thought of as being not anti-racist would, you know, upset them, would upset students as well. But I think we are in a particular historical period where liberal values, I'm interested more and more about reading about the history of liberalism, because I think that's what's damaging and that's what's giving resistance, the kind of lip service and the kind of nods, but actually not doing the action and not doing the work of anti-racism, which is, as you said, Riley, is exhausting and tiring and gets put on the shoulders then of the people who do that work, rather than it being a shared collective endeavor. So yes, I think without kind of, you know, not giving a kind of clear direction here, I think that we need to kind of find ways of moving beyond kind of liberalness and think about how we can be more activist in our workplaces, because there will always be resistance if there's always a dominant liberal paradigm.
Thank you. Grace, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think everyone has touched a sore spot for me in terms of these challenges and resistances that many of us have faced. So I think I'll point out one thing in particular for me were physical environments. The very place I face resistance is in my classrooms, and I've been using them for ways to engage with co-collaborators with disabilities. And there are many ways where our classrooms are not fully accessible for disability needs. So for example, very, very heavy doors without having what's that squishy thing that like helps hold the doors that, you know, violates fire safety rules, to just even the desk height sometimes not being adjustable for someone who is not in an electric wheelchair, but in a manual wheelchair that is a bit lower. There's all types of ways where I think it's not just about disability, but the way our body postures are, how we change as we age. Those factors have not been considered in the very classrooms that we try to teach, you know, about this sense of inclusiveness and universality of disability and needs. And so when I'm trying to do that with my students, it's become increasingly, of course, frustrating that like now it's great to have closed captioning, but is like the color contrast bright enough on the projector that's like from 1990, or is it all these little small things that I think many people could take for granted for their physical resources and think that the available real estate is there for faculty, when in fact it is not for many majority, and especially for a class that needs to be about, you know, pretty much ADA compliance. And so to me, I find it ironic that I'm teaching about, you know, why aren't there ADA compliances for the clothing that we inhibit, which is inaccessible for many people, but the very spaces that we're still in after 30 plus years of the Disability Act here in America, that's not even implemented in some of our, you know, higher education universities. So that's like very low hanging fruit, but to me has been a continual thing that I literally physically face. And I'm 5'3", so holding some of those doors and multitasking and making sure everyone is moving around, I think has been quite the exercise.
Yeah, and I know those doors well, and access is not for granted in any way. Thank you very much for really the range and complexity of your responses to this question. I think it's fascinating to learn and to discuss how this kind of resistance is very physical and material in our classrooms, sort of routine and everyday meetings and what is said or not said, to structural, to how we support faculty or don't support faculty, to even thinking of the larger systems of liberalism and how that impacts the ways in which social justice can move through a university. And of course, understanding how our own positions and locations influence the ways in which we have privilege to engage in these conversations or to push back or not, as we think about our own job security and careers and livelihoods as well. I want to conclude by asking you to share one learning for the folks listening today. So based on your experiences that you wrote about in your chapter, or perhaps experiences you've had since then, what's one piece of wisdom that you might offer to fashion students or educators who want to advance social justice in their work and are often trying to do so in spaces that aren't often designed or aligned with this very purpose? And I know we have about 10 minutes left, so maybe the one piece of wisdom can be shared in about 1 to 2 minutes. So Tanveer, I'm going to start with you.
Hi. Yes, so for me, I think it would be looking for absences. Who isn't at the table? So I think starting every single conversation that you have, thinking about, who's not here, then digging and drilling deeper. Why aren't they here? How long haven't they been here for? And how can we get them here? So I think it's always looking for the absences. I'm really inspired by the thinker Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who talks about the sociology of absences. And it's such a useful framework because when you start to see what's missing, you start to kind of reconfigure the jigsaw and you can see how you can build towards social justice and a different alternative.
Thank you. Grace.
I think, let's see, I really believe designing for people is giving way to the idea of designing with people. And I think this attitude is something that, will include to be a driving factor for more inclusive conversations, especially in fashion and design in general. But there's a lot of fear produced on maybe being wrong, mispronouncing someone's pronoun, or offending someone. And so I think the one advice I would give is like to really ask questions and to find or discover like your local groups and organizations that are normally not in your social circle. I see this a lot with students who are like, I want to make like a wearable glove for someone with Alzheimer's. And I say, do you know anyone with Alzheimer's? And it's a very simple question, but it's just, put yourself out there and really find different groups, I think is something that is kind of hard to do, but also the first step to really collaborating with others.
Thank you. Sang, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. For me, I think speaking about this idea of resistance, I think what really stood out for me was this idea of, I guess, encouraging everyone to come to the discussion with a learning mindset. It's something that one of the professors leading the reconciliation work really emphasized. And I think it's really difficult for someone like of my cultural background where the shame of publicly being wrong is very real and no one likes to be wrong. But if you can create a space where there's space to be wrong and space to be corrected in a way that I think removes a lot of that stigma, I think it really helps. And I think it's really difficult kind of space to contend with because we can't always speak from a place of authority as as a teacher and academic as well. We try to. I mean, that's kind of what we're there for, to impart knowledge. But I think it's always important to remember that we are probably not the knowledge keepers in relation to the lived experience of others as well, to be able to make that space for students or whoever else you're inviting into the conversation.
Thank you. Riley.
I think I would offer that maybe or probably the place for Indigenous fashion isn't in the academy. I think we talk a lot about always looking to include the community, whatever that means. And that often implies the community coming in to the academy, which is needed, absolutely needed. But there's like implied in that is like this directional flow of like the academy is where knowledge is created and we need to bring others into the academy. But I think I'd like to reverse that and not go out into communities, because I think there's like a danger of helicoptering and further marginalizing communities, but perhaps supporting or exporting skills and resources of the academy into communities. Like I'm interested in thinking about and supporting the fashion that happens beyond the four walls of the classroom, because fashion is happening out there. Arguably more creative, more innovative, more sustainable forms of fashion are happening outside of the academic classroom. And then perhaps one more additional learning, whenever anyone asks me, how can I support Indigenous fashion? I often say, save the planet. Without a planet, we don't have Indigenous fashion. Indigenous fashion is land-based, so we need clean land, we need clean drinking water, we need healthy, animal populations, healthy plants to create Indigenous fashion. So I think climate justice is top of mind for me when I think about how to support Indigenous fashion.
Thank you, Riley. And Kelly.
I think that my one piece of advice is to look at the structure in which you are operating and look for the ways for structural change. And so, for example, I pitched a course, and it can be easy to just say, oh, we don't need that course anymore, right? But then if you look at, okay, well, what are the things that are guiding the piece that you're in? And so, for example, what are the program learning outcomes, or like how's the curriculum built? And so, and looking at those. And so one thing that we did was, we developed the course, spearheaded this new initiative to make a new minor called Fashion, Culture, History, and Social Justice. And so this course then was put into the core of that. And then what happened was, I was like, well, we have all these other courses, fashion history. And I was like, we need to also flip those courses. I mean, we have this new minor, so the courses that all the students are taking. And so it was like a way to say, okay, this is this one course. But then I was like, well, I pitched this idea, and then it like filtered down to the other courses that we had. And so as opposed to teaching like fashion history from this like white heteronormative perspective, I was like, okay, well, 50% of these courses now have to like center justice. And then I had to like work with those instructors to then help them change their courses. So that was like a way to help the other faculties change their mindset to think about like how they can center justice, and not in like some like revolutionary way. It was like small, right? It was like, okay, you're going to change this much of your course. It'll take work, but like think about it that way, right? And so my advice would be like, yeah, like look at like the ways that like that will impact the structure of where you're working, and try to disrupt that.
Thank you. I think when Deb and I first thought up this volume and we put out a call for contributors 4 years ago, it was often came from our own conversations that change was happening, maybe with a few individuals in different fashion schools, but often the experience of trying to create that change was alienating because of resistance. And so part of this was, how do we bring together a collective of folks that are doing this work in their institutions to share experiences and to offer advice, so others doing this work also don't feel alienated or alone where they are, and can help propel change. And 4 years ago was a different time based on the conversations we're having now in fashion and fashion education. But these contributions are, I think, just as, if not even more meaningful, because through your work, you're all showing where change happens in the classroom, where resistance occurs, but also what can be done, not just to chip away at the current system of fashion education, but to work on actually rebuilding a new foundation and what that could look like in a much more expanded and equitable and inclusive way. I really want to thank all of you for sharing your experiences, just with such honesty and generosity. This has been such a rich conversation for me to get to hear from you, not just reading what you've written, but hear really about what you've done. And thank you for sharing this with everyone.